Hey friends and fellow supporters of the arts, thanks and welcome to one of the first videos that I'm going to do that's going to be for patrons only. And one of the things that I want to do here on Patreon, among many others, is I want to have some fun. I realized that with the completion of the Pandemic Poems project that I had just published my 25th book when In the Days of Our Resilience came out. And I thought I had actually sort of lost count and I had to go back and redo the count. And it is true that the fourth book of that series is my 25th book. So I thought that one thing that would be really fun to do here on Patreon would be to go back to the very beginning and walk through each one of my books, and kind of tell the story about it, where it came from, what some of the poems in it are. Not reading too many poems, but just giving you an idea and a feel for each one of the books that I have done. And so, starting with number 1, this is the very first book, Hobson's Choice. This came out in 2002. And this collection here contained all the poems from my master's degree in creative writing that I got at the University of Oklahoma. So basically what it was is this was my thesis, and I took the poems from my thesis and I kind of thinned them out and edited them and worked on them, and put them into my first book. The graphic design here was done by the wonderful Christopher Everett up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, I believe, living in Wisconsin in Glenwood City. And so Chris has done a lot of awesome graphics work for me over the years, and I'm very, very grateful to him. I also should express my gratitude to Dr. Gladys Lewis, a longtime friend of the family, a professor at the University of Central Oklahoma, and she owned Greystone Press up in Edmond, Oklahoma, and she's the one that took the chance on me, and she published my first book, in spite of some, highly questionable work in it. There are things in this book that I look back on and they cause me some pain, to see them. And I kind of like, why? Oh, wish I could get that out of there. But fortunately for me, this is no longer available. It's no longer in print, so to speak. I happen to have copies left over for people who are weird and maybe collectors, and just kind of want that strangeness of it, or maybe people who like to see the bad poems and gloat, that kind of thing, whatever turns you on. But the thing that was really strange about this book, first of all, the award-winning winner of the American Book Award, Denise Chavez, for her book Face of an Angel, gave me a blurb, a quote for this. And Robert Kahn Davis Undiano, executive director of World Literature Today magazine, gave me a blurb for this. So maybe it wasn't as bad as I'm making it out to be. However, one of the things that I have to say and be honest about this book is that one of the best pieces of writing in the book is the introduction that was written by Billy Crockett. Yes, it is true. One of the best pieces of writing in the book was by someone else. So, how can you not read that? This is really, there are some incredible moments in this. A book of poetry is not a travelogue. They have another section in the store for that. It is a crisis. Poetry is a precarious, high-wire act of faith in words to reveal, to name, to remember, to whisper or shout the news of who we are again and again. It is as necessary an item as is liable to be on any shelf in any store, with the possible exception of diapers and the blues. The foreknowledge of the dim state of poetry sales must be particularly liberating to the author. He may apply himself single-mindedly to the crisis at hand. Nathan Brown's poems are experiments in soul play. His keen eye for the hidden agendas of this world is tempered with a wink and the suspicion of joy. This collection of poems has suggested to me the idea of the poet sleuth. See him there with one giant eye behind the thick rounded glass. He is always looking. Time may stretch out forever in the discovery of a certain softness or a slight catch in the breath. And that's not a problem because the poet's currency is time. It's not that he has any more of it than anybody else. He's simply chosen to spend it investing the interiors and intimations of his world. He is always willing to see what he sees, willing to give up the idea of hoarseness for the possibility of an actual horse, whatever that may be. And it goes on, but I do want to read just the last two. And by the way, maybe you want get with me if you'd like to have a copy and read his entire introduction. By the way, I do believe that this introduction also reappears, I think, in full in my new and selected poems book that came out years later called Karma Crisis. And I do believe I reprinted this introduction. But let me skip over and just read the last two paragraphs real quickly. The authority to express derives from the human capacity to feel one's way along this world, to take notes, and to risk posting the results. And one more thing. One must love words when they do sometimes integrate and illuminate experience. So maybe there is no choice for the poet after all. He sees something, he knows he must employ language, he must redeem words, and it is finally an issue of loyalty. He is credible, he is more than entitled because he knows he is in the world for this, to name the animals, to respond, to evoke, to conflict, to defend, to risk, to honor. It is a high calling not only to the oppressed, but to each of those rare and courageous beings of any age, color, creed, and bank balance, willing to take up the life as well as the pen. So you can see what I mean. It's and let me tell you, every paragraph in between the ones that I read you is just as extraordinary and fantastic. It really is an essay, and it should be like published separately or something. And so what I do, I'm just going to do a couple of poems from the book. And one of the ones that I want to read you is a poem that was a bit of a game changer for me. And so it is a poem that I, continue to be happy with and continue to like. But in reading it and performing it, really taught me that I could be a performer of poetry and that audiences could enjoy poetry because I had great experiences with this. And after I read you the poem, I'm going to tell you one quick story that is my favorite example of what I mean by that. There was a wonderful professor of philosophy at the University of Oklahoma for many years, Tom Boyd. He was a much beloved professor at OU and is now living in Santa Fe with his wife Barbara, and I love to try to see them whenever I go out, but COVID has kind of messed with that lately. But I'll tell you the story about Tom Boyd after I read you this poem real quickly. The title is May Day, and underneath it is Saturday, May 1st, 1999. Black Nike Airs set a quick pace. Untanned calves flash in sunlight. A saffron robe with brown tasseled belt flaps down the side of I-35. Wireframe glasses struggle to support a concerned Cro-Magnon brow. Brown, bushy hair tries to cover up the shiny cue ball on top. A stoic shoulder harnessed with a 9-foot cross. Black rubber wheel attached to the bottom, a Walmart special. A sign on the back of the cross roars at traffic coming up behind. God wants prayer back in school. And I'm thinking, Jesus didn't get a wheel. Okay, so The thing about that poem, is it turns out that it doesn't seem like it, but it turns out that the whole poem is actually about the cheap rubber wheel from Walmart that he puts on the bottom of the Christ. And the poem seems like it's going to be winding down to some sort of big finish where I'm just really going to let him have it and go all theological on everybody. And I wind it down to simply that. Jesus didn't get a wheel. And so what happened was I was at an event where Tom Boyd was speaking, and I was sort of the preliminary, entertainment, blah, whatever, and I was to come up and read a couple of poems at this event. And so Tom Boyd was sitting over here in his chair waiting to come speak after I was done. And I noticed that with every line as I kind of went into it, he was leaning in and getting more and more intent on, he wanted to know what was going to happen to this guy. And when I got to that finish, he reeled in his chair and kind of slapped his knees. And then he got up to speak, and I think he said, something about it, but I don't remember that part. Here's what I do remember is that after the event was over, Tom Boyd came up to me, and I'm going to tell you this. I want to tell you, he came, it was actually more like he came at me. I was kind of scared. And, he's this wonderful kind of white-haired, white-bearded, red-faced man, he came at me, but then held his hand out and grabbed my hand, and he just shook it really hard. He goes, and he kept hold of my hand and kind of pulled me toward him. And he said, God, I just love it when a poem does that thing at the end like that. So, a professor of philosophy, published over 30 books, one of the most well-spoken, one of the best speakers I've ever heard in my life, with the biggest vocabulary of anybody I've ever known, one of the most educated, well-read, well-rounded, and unbelievable people I've ever known, said, thing. That thing in the end. And so what happened was, that was my first book, right? And what I realized is that my career from that point forward was that I was in search of that thing. I may not have achieved it every single time in every poem, but that's it. Well, all this argument about, the academics and the blah, and what is poetry and what isn't poetry, and is it okay if it's accessible? Is it okay if it makes sense? Is it, all these things, oh my gosh, whatever. The thing is, for me, what I'm looking for in art, but especially when I write poetry, is I'm trying to find my way to that thing at the end. And that has long and always been my goal. That's what I'm after. So I'll just do one more poem from this book, and we'll call this a first session and see how it goes. And you can let me know if it's too long. It's like, hey, shorten it. Or do you like this? Do you like hearing the stories about the books? If you do like the stories, maybe I can do a video series on each one of my books and tell you the story behind it and read a few poems from it. But, don't be afraid to speak up and tell me about length or what you would like to hear more of and less of. That'll help me shape this thing. But it's going to be a fun project. It's going to be fun to do this with you. And it was also very fun to go back over this book again and just see all the things that I had forgotten. But there's one other thing about this book. And in this book is a poem called Rhetoric. And it is one of the only poems of mine that I have memorized. And so, because I often quote it at the end of things that I do, even when poetry's not involved or whatever. So like if it's music or speaking or things like that, somebody will say, well, what about one of your poems? Read us one of your poems. And if I don't have a book, then I always just recite this one. This was a poem that I wrote while in a graduate level creative writing class, one of those critiquing courses. And it was with my professor, George Economo. And I remember him looking over his glasses at the class one time and saying, "We don't rhyme poems anymore." I think it was after somebody had read maybe a bad rhyming poem. And so of course I came back to class next week with this poem and sort of read it at him. Rhetoric. After all of the words, the nouns, and the verbs, I froze in a moment of dread. For what we all thought was something turned out to be nothing. No thing had actually been said. So I hope in some way, somehow, someday, before the rolls are read, to think of a new thing and someday say something, for nothing's already been said. Okay, how fun. I love it. Thank you all for tuning in. My gosh, if you listened to this far, thank you. And please, any folks that you know who might enjoy this Patreon page, please let them know. Give them a heads up and bring them on into the party. I would love to have them with us. This is going to be fun, and there's more to come. Thanks. Love you guys. See you next time. And as I always say at the end of Fire Pit Sessions, keep reading poetry. It's a little bit of sanity in a world gone completely mad.